Yo! This episode, I am speaking with one of the country's foremost authorities on geology, so it's only natural that our sponsor is Trace Minerals Research. As many of you already know, aggressive farming practices over the last several decades have stripped our soil of their natural resources. The result is farmed food with an increasing deficiency in nutrients and natural minerals. Luckily, there are still some deposits of vast natural minerals still left in the world, one of which is Utah's inland sea, which is a surviving inland sea that has evaporated, leaving a particularly rich harvest of minerals and trace minerals like chromium, manganese, iron, zinc, lithium, selenium, boron, etc., that are critical for our body's ability to function. Minerals are the elements that comprise the entire universe, this earth and everything on it, including you. If you're going camping, hiking, anything, sports camps, whatever you're doing this summer that might leave you a little dehydrated, this is the spectacular way to go to replenish the system. So put a few drops in whatever you're drinking. Heck, my ex used to put it in her booze. Anything you can think of, just put a couple drops in and get those minerals back in your system. Whatever you're drinking, put a few drops of concentrated trace minerals in you. We got a link right on our website. And while you're on the webpage, make sure you sign up to become a member. You get all sorts of benefits and specials and discounts on everything, especially from our sponsors, many of which cheaper than Amazon. So really no excuse. We'll be having published data studies. We'll be having special events, which are all only going to be available to members only. It's only $1 a month, and it's a great way to support the podcast. In fact, we're so excited about having new members that we have a event this month. The next 2 people who sign up to become members will receive gifts from our sponsors. So yeah, the next 2 people, anybody, whoever it is, not only will I be a huge fan of yours, but you'll get some special prizes from our sponsors. So yeah, that's exciting. Check it out and become a member, and we'll reward you for it. And while you're at it, check out some things on our online store. Everything for members is on discount. We've got, there's a couple things we can put up on the website for you. We've got these toothbrushes that we import from Korea that are tremendous. The best I've ever used. So we have a lot of people that I know that travel for business. A lot of my clients travel. A lot of them have chucked their electric toothbrushes just because they're too tedious to travel with and use these instead. And they eventually switch over and end up just using these. They're tremendous. They're the best toothbrushes I've found. Some other fun things on our website, Party Smart. It's the summertime. There's a lot of weddings and graduations and barbecues and family events going on. If you are going to be drinking more than you normally would, this is a great way to mitigate the consequences. People always ask, does it work? I mean, are you going to be shotgunning a bottle of Jack Daniels with a beer bong? Then no, nothing's going to work. But if you are just knowing that you're going to be going to a wedding and seeing family and having a few more tequila poppers than you normally would, then yeah, this is definitely going to help those who are not necessarily as keen on drinking as they used to be. Or heck, I have tons of college kids that use it just to hedge their bets about getting to class in the morning. So that's a great thing. That's on the website. There's tons of fun stuff in our online store. So check it out. We'll have links to all these up on the website, and enjoy the episode.
If you listen closely, you can hear the voices.
You can hear them whisper their legacy to you. Go on, lean in.
From somewhere deep inside the evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest.
Seattle!
Everything you know is wrong.
Wrong, sir. Wrong.
With Jeremy Horn.
You're an inhuman monster. I said good day.
My guest this episode is David Montgomery. David Montgomery is a professor of Earth and Space Science at the University of Washington, and he is one of the premier geologists in the country, if not the world. He's far too humble to cop to that, but hell, I'll say whatever I want. He's a truly a brilliant mind, specifically geomorphology, which is how environments change over time. I first became aware of him with his book Dirt: The Erosion of Civilizations, which kind of explores how the evolution of topography can directly track the influences of ecological systems on human societies. More generally, how our empires throughout human history can be tracked and traced and watched, how they've treated their soil and how they've expanded and grown, and then how they've eventually fallen apart from overextending their resources. So it's kind of a roadmap to how to lose an empire and how to ruin an empire, which for the U.S., hey, it's something we better pay attention to because our empire is slipping through our fingers day after day. He's a regular talking head on multiple shows on PBS, and he is a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship grant, which, as many people know, is they call it the Genius Grant, and it's pretty remarkable. I never knew the process of how. I knew you didn't get nominated. I knew it's something that you got handpicked from, but I didn't necessarily the process. But he gets into it, and it's pretty exciting. But yeah, he has written essentially a trilogy of books. Dirt was how I had learned about him, and then the next is The Hidden Half of Nature, which we delve into a lot in this episode, which is kind of discusses the ecosystems within dirt itself, within soil itself, that he co-wrote with his wife Anne, which is more than just literally the surface of soil, but actually the universes that are within it that comprise it. And the last is Growing a Revolution, which is bringing our soil back to life. It's basically a trilogy of how we screwed over our soil, what we can do about it, and how. So those are the three books in order. We've got it. We'll have links to them on the website. We encourage you to check it out. But in the meantime, enjoy the episode. He's a thrill to talk to. Enjoy. Well, first off, welcome. What do you think of the Treetop Tavern?
Oh, well, thanks. It's very Hobbit-like.
It is, right? Yeah, you feel it.
Yeah, well, so that round door is a dead giveaway.
Yeah. Unmistakable. Yep. Even if someone's never seen Lord of the Rings, I think they have, they know at least what a Hobbit door looks like. Well, welcome, Dave. I was glad to have you here.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you.
Yeah, we want to do. Well, first of all, one thing I was just for my own curiosity is the fellowship, the MacArthur Fellowship. That's not something you apply to. Right?
No, in fact, when you get the phone call, you don't even know you've been nominated.
That's hilarious.
It's completely out of the blue.
That's amazing to me. That
was amazing to me, too.
I'll bet. It's like going up to your mailbox, opening up and be like, yeah, you just been drafted by the Lakers. Like, really? I was in the draft? Nice.
Yeah, I can play basketball.
I can play basketball? Yeah, good to know.
Yeah, no, that was a complete surprise. I was actually in a hotel room in Baltimore when I got the phone call and was like, really? Why are you calling me? Who are you and why are you calling?
How'd you find my hotel room?
Yeah, exactly. There was a major conspiracy among friends that would make sure that they would knew where I was, but I was clueless.
Right. Oh, I gotcha. I see. Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, what was your first response when you got that call? What was your natural?
I was like, really? What kind of a joke is this?
Yeah.
You kidding me?
Yeah.
Who put you up to this?
Exactly. Yeah. Isn't that
and the guy assured me that no, it was actually true, and had I heard of them, I was like, well, yeah. Why are you calling me?
I have.
And it turned out to be legit, and it was actually quite difficult for the next week to not tell anybody.
Oh yeah, I can imagine.
But they have an incredibly good. It's sort of a program of secrecy in terms of between when they tell people and when they do their press release on it. You're really supposed to keep it completely under wraps.
You have to, yeah.
Yeah, because it's kind of big news that gets out, and it's one of the things that there's sort of a media.
And they want the announcement.
Around.
Exactly. They want the announcement so that then everything branches off from that.
Exactly. And they're doing something so nice to you.
Right.
That it's are you really going to try to do something that would screw it up for them?
You're going to be the jerk. You want to be the one jerk that ruined it for everybody.
Exactly.
It's such a nice thing.
So it's a pretty amazing thing. They are very serious about investing in people they see as very creative with no strings attached.
Right.
So it's, I'm an academic. I've been putting grants in for the last 20 years for things. Usually you have to say, I'm going to do this, and here's how I'm going to do it. Lay your whole plan out. And then you send them a report afterwards and so forth. The MacArthur Foundation doesn't ask you for a plan. They just ask you, they just basically have faith that you're going to do something creative and interesting with their funding and allow you to sort of further what you think is the right thing that you need to do. And for me, that has been trying to write sort of books about science, but for a broader, more popular audience, because I don't think that enough scientists are really trying to communicate outside the world of science.
I think that's what they appreciated too, is that how do you take these complex ideas and deliver them in a form where someone can be like, oh, I see how that applies to me, as opposed to it's so far out there, I don't know how this affects me, so I'm not going to worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a great need in today's world where you have so many people who are pushing the bounds of knowledge to, limits that, even just 20 years ago we never would have really thought about or imagined. How do you get that information and what it means for society to the general public, to policymakers? How do you get it sort of out beyond the people who are on that active margin of knowledge as it expands?
That's a good point, because it changes so rapidly now too. especially in the internet age. Everything just changes so rapidly, so quickly, and information is something you believed, 2 years ago. Suddenly you're like, oh, that's dead wrong. Now that's dead wrong. Wow. And I think people get overwhelmed. I think it's so easy to get overwhelmed.
Well, and it's easy to sort of get the perception that, if science is always changing, well, what can we really know?
True.
Why tune in? Why base stuff on it? And science is an endeavor that is always changing, and every now and then, what we thought to be true gets completely flipped on its head, which is really exciting as a scientist. Yeah. But it kind of runs counter to the popular narrative of how science works in terms of putting facts together and stringing knowledge along. Part of science is the context of how you look at those facts, the framework, the way you organize things in your brain around the bits of knowledge that you do gather together in whatever discipline. And those moments when that framing changes are really exciting times of opportunity, because what you thought to be true may turn out to have been only a little piece of a bigger picture.
If you're trying to expand your knowledge base, it's very exciting. But if you see change as a threat, I think that's where a lot of times people get very uncomfortable, where I've seen people try to argue with brilliant scientific minds, and that say, well, then, so gravity is just a theory. It's like, well, again, everything in the world. It's like, no, well, the Bible's absolute. I'm like, well, once again, that's what's defeating the purpose of the conversation, is that we're not looking at things in terms of absolutes. We're looking at, a broader realm,
Yeah, and there are, there's also the sort of the problem of semantics in terms of engagement with ideas. And theory is just like the perfect word for that discussion, because the theory of gravity is a pretty damn good theory.
Pretty solid theory.
Every time I've thrown a rock, it goes a certain distance and then it drops.
But you're saying there's a chance of go ahead and walk off that building. If you want to test that theory, maybe you're the one. One of my favorite comedians, Mark Maron, is Jewish, right? And he's just kind of like, he's like, I enjoy getting in theological debates, because Jewish people have a different concept of heaven and hell. He's like, but he's just kind of like, every time people talk in absolutes with religion, it's always strange to me, because I just picture Jesus coming back and going to a Walmart or Target during Christmas and be like, no, you all got it wrong. All of you got it wrong. There's your absolute.
Yeah. Well, and I suspect that's exactly what he's thinking.
No, this is not. No.
Not what I had in mind.
Thank you for the birthday celebration, but no, this is not what I had in mind. Isn't that great?
Oh yeah.
Well, I think that's perfect. So you said, what can we really rely on? What are these truths? And one thing, so I've always been fascinated by minerals, and it's something that you ask the average person about geology or minerals, and they tune out. It doesn't seem sexy or interesting, but it's such a critical component of what makes us. Period. What we are as people. Some of the most basic components that we completely disregard. And secondly, you remember back, like, I always think nowadays there's always a new epidemic. Epidemic is a term now that's just used in like casual conversation. That blows my mind. Back in the 80s and 90s, epidemic used to mean everybody freaked the hell out. That means everybody panic, right? Now with SARS and bird flu and there's a new epidemic every week, to the point where people go, did you hear that zinc mineral deposits are being extincted in the U.S. in soil deposits? And people are like, oh, wow, that's troubling. But anyway, so what's next week there's gonna be a new epidemic, right? And to the point where I remember somebody was, I think it was Aziz Ansari, was on Saturday Night Live and was right after a tragedy, and I genuinely couldn't remember what tragedy is, because there's another school shooting 2 weeks later that I'm like, oh my God, that is horrifying. Everybody remembers where we were when the Challenger exploded, but now suddenly, like, I barely remember where I was when Columbine, happened, or I barely remember when Sandy Hook. It's just a new disaster every time, and I think people have become overwhelmed, and I think people have just...
I think that's one of the dangers of the information age, is that people are really good at processing information and accumulating information, but you can still be overloaded, like you're describing. And that's a problem also in looking at sort of attitudes about the environment, in that there's been 20, 30, 40 years now of serious and quite legitimate concern about things like climate change, about groundwater supplies, about our future energy sources, about biodiversity, about what's happening to the fertility of the soils that we depend on to get those nutrients out of those rocks and into plants, so we can eat them, or we can eat the animals that eat them. And if you have this steady drumbeat of crisis and everything is going wrong,
right,
it can really it can be numbing.
It's hard to be practical. It's hard to like, what can I practically do about it?
And it's hard to motivate to get off. If
we're all spiraling into nothingness anyway, what do you want me to do?
Right.
So it's easy to,
And so that's one of the things I try and take on in my new book, Growing Our Evolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, is that it's one of those cases where there actually are practical things that farmers can do that benefit them, that are in society's long-term best interest. And it's actually kind of a good news story about how we might be able to do something quite positive about the environment, because in that case, short-term economics are starting to line up with our long-term interests in preserving the fertility of the soil and its ability to grow a lot of food. And quite frankly, I think we need people who are engaged in writing and communicating to the general public need to try and find some of those good news stories, because a steady drumbeat of crisis and bad news
becomes crippling for action.
Can very much become crippling and paralyzing in terms of motivating.
Yep.
And we're legitimately at a very critical juncture for the human species in this 21st century. There's enough of us now that we really govern what happens on the surface of the world.
Right.
So the future of the rest of nature is pretty much in our hands.
Yeah.
And we're not really thinking strategically about how to sort of guide to some kind of outcome we'd like. We're kind of muddling along on 6-month and 2-year and 4-year policy cycles.
It feels like in exactly, the short term. It feels like in comedies or cartoons where 4 people are stuck in a raft and then one of them just eats the entire supply for the week. Like, what are you doing? And it's like, I was hungry. It's just so self-absorbed, and we're stuck on a raft indefinitely, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, Earth is a raft in space.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some pretty legitimate questions about how long humanity would be able to survive if we went out into space, just from radiation shielding, other kind of sources, and also whether we could take the other organisms with us that we need to be healthy. I mean, the discoveries about the microbes that live within us in the last few decades and how central they are to our health.
Right.
That really brings up the question of, if we really set off to go to another solar system, you sort of take the science fiction fantasy of getting off this planet and going out and colonizing space. Are we going to be able to take all the other components of our internal ecosystems with us when we don't even know what they fully are yet?
Right, truly. We're just really discovering. I mean, probiotics and things like that, and gut flora is something that's a discussion that's only happened in the less than a decade, really less than a decade, of aggressively searching, of just like not just knowing about it, but being like, oh my God, it's like splitting the atom. There's more stuff inside? I thought this was it. That's it? There's more stuff? Yeah. Yeah,
and particularly sort of that it's actually central to the way that your immune system operates. We used to think of microbes as germs, right? Things that we want to scrub off of ourselves, sanitize out of our lives. And in that last 10, 20 years, we've really learned the mechanisms through which those community of organisms within us actually bolster our immune system and act as its intelligence arm.
Right.
Which means that if we don't have certain microbes living within us, our immune system's kind of flying blind.
Can't send those messages and relay orders, yeah.
And that can lead to out of control inflammation. And you look at the kind of chronic diseases that are afflicting people today.
Yeah.
They're mostly inflammation related. And there's some serious efforts to try and link that to changes in our internal microbiota, our microbiome and our gut microbiome in particular. 30 years ago, that was crazy talk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Now it's in all the journals.
Yeah. I've been doing this for 25 years. So people look at my age and they see the people that I speak with and lecture with and teach with and like, what's going on? You know what I mean? Like, who's the weirdo with the mohawk? I saw him on PBS. I don't know who that guy is, right? But that's why 25 years ago, I was having this conversation with people way smarter than me that were amazed that a high school college kid, you know what I mean, had been reading the same journals they had. And it's because nobody was discussing it. Nobody else would have that conversation with you. So it's a thrill to see how now it's becoming part of the conversation. And now they've changed. They used to call it the second brain. Well, now they're calling it the other brain because the brain and the gut have to relay messages so systematically, entirely. It's like saying like, well, there's, some circulatory channels and the ones in your feet. They're all the same circulations. It's your same veins and arteries, right?
They're all connected.
They're all connected. And so now it's interesting to me that I see the dialogue has even changed. Where instead of calling it the second brain, neurologists and gastroenterologists are now discussing and being like, I'm now partnering with people I never would have talked to 10 years ago. You know what I mean? 5 years ago. This is very fascinating. But I think going going back to the point you were saying is that I think it's hard for people because here's these complicated, very complicated ideas that are just happening or brand new. And then so people are like, how does that mean to me? I was like, I don't know. We're still learning ourselves. But then you have Jamie Lee Curtis going like, well, just eat this. Right. And then everyone's like, oh, that's all. And I think people feel like even if it's true, you know, and even if it's important information, it can't just be in this plastic thing full of strawberries and sugar, you know what I mean? Being hawked on TV. And people are right. No, that's not the full conversation. But yes, at least we're discussing it.
Right. We've gotten to the point recently with the gut microbiome and its importance to our own health where we can identify the mechanisms through how it works. So it's no longer just sort of like this strange new age voodoo magic. No, there's actually real connections.
Right.
But there's so many different species of microbes that make up our gut microbiome. And yours is so different from mine, is so different from everybody else's. They're all kind of unique ecosystems. And if you start looking at them that way, it becomes not that surprising to think that, well, maybe if you know, when you look at probiotics, say, which species should you eat?
Exactly.
And the answer may differ for different people. And what combination should you eat? So we're just starting, I think, to get to the point where we can really ask the right questions that will lead to that will lead us to a better understanding of what the answers really are. But that's not stopping the commercial applications from pushing ahead.
Right.
Just eat this one because I'm selling it.
Yep.
But it's an exciting time scientifically because we've had this sort of fundamental shift in thinking that is starting to focus on, what are the community dynamics of the ecology within you? And I think very few of us, especially those who went to college a few decades ago, we're really trained to think of our bodies as ecosystems.
Right.
We're trained to think of, our bodies as part of larger ecosystems.
Like mechanics, like you can,
Yeah, and that we're a piece of something bigger,
Yep.
but not so much about how do those little pieces within us integrate and interact ecologically, and what is it that we do, especially what we eat.
Right.
How does that influence what's happening in our internal Amazon?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it. Is I always have to reframe the question. I know what people are asking, but they're asking it incorrectly. But nobody's correcting them. You know what I mean? So people always go, well, what's the best one? I'm like, what do you mean, which one? That's like saying I'm only going to eat one fruit, pick a fruit. Well, you're missing out a whole subsegment of nutrients in vegetables and other types of fruits that have different enzymes and different components of bioflavonoids.
Yeah, and it may be the diversity of inputs that is actually a key part of the benefit to you.
And I think the key is the diversity. And I think people are slowly coming around to that. Because, our government finally chucked the food pyramid, which anybody has known for decades is nonsense. And they finally copped to it, right? And then they introduced, and I remember they tried this, instead of saying eat your this many servings a day, and they tried it, they released it to the U.S. public and our educational system, and it just tanked, was try to eat 5 different colors a day.
Yeah, eat the rainbow.
Eat the rainbow. Yeah. And it's a great idea. It's great for kids. They just didn't do a good job of really applicating and applying it or explaining why. Because it sounded like the government's now marketing to us, which they are.
To me, it's that explaining why part is the really key. Because when my wife and I were working on our book, The Hidden Half of Nature, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health, we started it not really knowing that much about microbes. And at the end, we were really up on a lot of these things. And one of the key revelations to me that came out of researching that book was an understanding of why my doctor was always telling me to eat more fiber. Every time I'd gone to the doctor for 20 years, it was like, Dave, you should eat more fiber. It's like, yeah, okay, sure. But I never got a why.
Yeah.
And so it was really hard to motivate to do something just because somebody's telling you to do it. It's
true.
It's the same thing with the government saying eat the rainbow in terms of the food pyramid. It's like, well, why? Just because you say so?
Right.
It's
true.
Am I really going to do that?
Right.
No. That's not a terribly American response to things.
Exactly.
But when you understand why, once I got into the understanding the microbial ecology and realizing that it's those hard to digest fiber-rich foods that have complex carbohydrates that we don't have the enzymes to break down and digest, but that our gut microbiota do.
Yeah.
That the idea that they ferment that stuff in our colon and turn it into medicinal metabolites that nourish our colon lining and prevent things like leaky gut syndrome.
Right.
And that help quell chronic inflammation through their metabolic influence on us from their metabolites. So it's our health is governed not by them or what we eat, but it's by them processing what we eat into other things that we absorb.
It's so fundamental. It's not the
And it's 30 years ago it was not known, and I had no doctor that ever told me eat more fiber told me that was why. And once you understand why, you go, oh, I get it.
You're more motivated. You're like, hey, we need more. We do need new fiber.
It's to feed the microbes that are within me that are actually beneficial to me.
Right.
And if I don't eat that fiber, the microbes that are less beneficial or harmful to me will take over the ecology of that important piece of my machinery, and I don't want that to happen.
Right.
So you get motivated.
It's hard to know the whole series of events and the whole cataclysm of things. It's kind of like looking at a car. I mean, like, hey, let's go buy this car. It's like, look how many pieces are in this car. Each one of those made, by a different set of machinery in a different country, different types of metals, all those complicated pieces. Like you say, when we're just told, do this because blah, it's like, what? You don't see all the mechanics behind what goes into it. Whereas most people know if you open a car hood, it's like, oh, there's an engine inside. Well, yeah, you knew there was an engine inside, right? I think most people didn't know the engine mechanics, and I think now they're finally beginning to discuss those. But it's still the nature being overwhelmed, where people still want to know. We have this weird notion, as people, what's the best? Just give me the best. I want to know the best one. I think people still try to wrap their heads around it. So that's the first thing I have to do is like, there is no best. Like you said, it's the biodiversity that your body's looking for. It needs different components for different things because you don't know what you're going to introduce it to. You might go to your sister's wedding and eat 10 hot dogs off the grill and a couple cupcakes. Yeah, you're gonna have a whole different set of floor for that than you are as if you're just eating regular peaches at home, right? And so one of the big things when you first told me about the Growing Revolution book, I was like, the title alone, I was like, that's exactly what it is. I think a lot of those misconceptions are very easy to fix. It's just getting people to stop the politicizing or stop setting their opinions and ideals first before the discussion. It's like, let's throw all of our ideals aside, then let's have the discussion, and then tell me what your idea is. As soon as you say something, people are immediately like, well, here's my take. Well, wait a minute.
Oh yeah.
Nobody's given their takes yet. Let's just have the conversation first, right? Is that kind of what you've seen?
Oh yeah. There's done a whole series of books now that have that people tend to go to their corners on when they first hear the issue.
Yep.
Whether it's my first book was about the environmental history of salmon, and when you ask people in different parts of the world, what was it that drove salmon close to extinction in their area? If you work for the timber industry, you're going to point to the fishermen. If you're a fisherman, you're going to point to the timber industry. Yep. People go to their corners easily. Or if you look at, I think the third book I wrote was about the history of science and religion, and looking at the story of Noah's flood through the eyes of how did geologists approach that story, and then approach studying the surface of the earth, and how did theologians approach it. But if you talk about evolution in today's society, people go to their corners.
It's amazing.
They kind of close their ears and they won't listen to each other very well. And part of that's inevitable given the nature of the subject. But what I found most interesting in researching that book was that if you just look at the history, the evolution of thought in theology, it helps explain to you an awful lot about the sort of the perceptions today.
Yeah.
And a lot of the arguments about sort of literal interpretations versus other more expansive interpretations of the Bible really play out in terms of thinking about how you interpret geology. You don't even have to get to evolution to demonstrate that the whole young Earth creationist model is flat out wrong.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's both expand the conversation. So I know people that are atheists are like, the Bible's a bunch of nonsense. And then we discover Jericho. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, there you go, right there. Right. Historical. Let's look at the history then. I don't care about your opinion. Let's look at the history right there, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like everybody wants to get on these dichotomies of it's this or that. It's like, no, let's look at the whole picture. There's probably more to that as well.
Oh yeah, and agriculture is one of those areas too. Where, a lot of the arguments immediately go to, well, it's organic versus GMO. Mm-hmm. And I actually don't think that's the right argument should be having.
At all.
We should be having the argument about how do we build very healthy, fertile soils that grow nutrient-dense foods.
Right.
And I visited a number of farms in researching Growing a Revolution that were not organic, but that was growing food in a way that I thought was, pretty sustainable.
Yep. Traditional, probably.
Well, it was an interesting range of things because it was not really traditional so much as a merging of modern science and traditional views, kind of a hybrid, taking the right principles. And it turned out there's sort of three key principles behind it that I'd be glad to go into, but that really showed how a farm that wasn't organic, if it adopted these principles for how do you regenerate the fertility and health of the soil, it moves closer to being organic, I like to call them organic-ish.
Yeah.
And some of these farmers, did not really want to be organic farmers for cultural reasons. But they were perfectly happy not spending money on agrochemicals because it's more money that stays in their pocket. And they like the idea that their soil's getting healthier and they're growing more nutrient-dense food that's better for people, because that's how they see themselves, as people who are feeding others.
Right.
And so, over time, they all became much closer to organic in their practices in ways that had tremendous benefits for the environment, but also good benefits for their farm.
And they could do it over time, as opposed to we need to make this farm profitable quick. Yeah.
Well, I was actually surprised how fast they did it.
Is that right?
2 to 3 years to turn.
Doesn't take much, I've heard. No. That's what I've heard from organic farmers.
And that really surprised me.
Did it really?
Yeah. And what also surprised me is they didn't have to go completely organic.
Right.
But that if they adopted these principles of regenerating their soil and its fertility, that's where those practices led them. And so I wonder whether we're having the wrong argument when we just simply talk about organic versus conventional, or GMOs versus organic.
It is the wrong conversation, because how do you make a pluot or whatever those new fruits you call, you know what I mean? Like when you take a plum and a kumquat and pick them together, you're like, yeah, these are delicious. Well, that's technically genetically modifying. Well, then when you get into chemically genetically modifying, that changes the context of the conversation. So like you said, people kind of get jumbled up in the terms without looking like, wait, what are we actually discussing here? GMO versus organic versus no, and the middle ground is.
Yeah, and you can miss like huge opportunities to engender radical change, transformative change in agriculture. Because if we could actually get conventional agriculture to go to this organic-ish model, because they can grow as much food at lower cost while improving their soil, in a way that has a smaller environmental footprint, everybody wins except the people selling agrochemicals.
Exactly.
And so, if we stick too closely to the argument of it's going to be conventional or it's organic,
right?
We kind of we risk losing sight of the opportunity to shift conventional as a body much closer to organic, and thereby blur the significance of the argument. Because if we could get a conventional agriculture down to using 10% of the agrochemicals they use, which is what some of these farmers that I visited in Researching Growing a Revolution had done, and they'd done it over like 3 to 10 years. It was kind of that kind of a time frame. And they were just as profitable, if not more profitable, than they were before, because their expenses were much lower. Way lower.
You're not tied into that. Yeah, exactly.
So if we can convert conventional agriculture to that kind of agriculture,
and it becomes cheaper as everybody, right? And as everybody begins to do that, and I think that's the problem. That's where organic come from, is because the way we treat our soil and the way we do farm is so offensive and so horrific that it takes an extreme change. You know what I mean? So I think that's where that kind of grew out of, because you have to, because again, if your mindset is that, like, when I remember in Congress something got presented as changing because Nabisco and companies like that couldn't follow organic standards and didn't want to pay for it. So like, let's just change the laws. Let's make it 80% organic, 20% arsenic, or whatever we want to, hydrogenated corn, or whatever they want to put in, right? But they're like, no, you're missing the point of why the organic standard is there. It's because you've been feeding people poison for so long that now we have to go in the opposite direction and be like, hey, we're not full of poison. Well, wait a minute. If you just said you're not full of poison, does that mean these are? And I think people had to make it a radical change in the way they thought. I do a lot of speaking for Centers for Eating Disorders, and I find I work with so many teens, and after working with them, the parents come back to me and say, we went to this center and this didn't help, but this center really helped us. And it's because now she cooks all the meals in the house. She buys all whole food. She does all the cooking. And I go, she even yells at me as a mom because I got the wrong stuff. I go, and she's right. And it's horrifying for the mother to think you contributed to this because she didn't know any better. The mom didn't know any better. She's just getting Campbell's soup off the shelf and, some Triscuits. I'm like, here's your dinner. Like, no, that's not good for a kid,
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the huge changes since the Second World War, is just in the amount of actual cooking that goes on in homes.
It's all processed. Even the light cooking that we do, even just like heating something up, came out of, that's been sitting there for God knows how long.
Warming up the processed stuff.
And, like you said, people go, how does this apply to me? I can see, even if they get the concepts, like, okay, but then again, why does this appeal to me?
Right, and once you sort of recognize that, one of the problems with a diet that's rich in processed foods isn't so much that it's processed per se.
Right.
But it's how it's processed, in the sense that, say you take a grain, wheat or let's stick with wheat. And you take that grain, and in processing it, you break the germ away from the bran and away from the endosperm. And, those 3 pieces of a seed are needed for it to be a viable seed.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of the fiber and the phytochemicals are in the bran and the end.
Exactly. the components that your body actually needs to break down and process. Yeah.
And when we process foods by basically taking the sugary part of the seed and putting that into white flour, you've taken away all those parts that will actually feed your gut microbiome.
And trigger the body to produce enzymes to be like, oh, got to break this thing down because it doesn't recognize those components.
And the stuff that's been processed, the simple sugars, will be absorbed fairly readily because our bodies can do that. But if we're not even eating the fiber component, we're essentially starving our microbiome, which will mean that they are not making the medicinal metabolites that are essential to our health.
Yep. People always use the term gluten-free, you know what I mean? And they always try to turn it into a politicized word, and people get in these arguments. I'm like, knock it off. First of all, my niece is celiac. So when people say gluten-free is just a thing invented by the media, really? Then how come a pan cooked in a restaurant can kill my niece? You know, we a dozen trips to the hospital in the past 2 decades, and you tell me, you know what I mean? Like, so that's silly, that's stupid. But they are right in the fact that now things have been kind of overblown. But once again, it's a response to, from what you were saying, all these things that we're getting that are not true food, that the body is not utilizing, now has an impact. It's like all these inflammatory illnesses. Turn of the century was all polio and mumps and measles, and these were all the diseases that, well, once we created vaccinations and things that control that, this new century is all these inflammatory conditions that don't show up on blood tests, that don't show up on doctors do scans and be like, everything looks normal. Then why am I miserable? And that's who I have been dealing with the past decade. Is people that say, my doctor said I'm the healthiest person in my age bracket they've ever seen, and yet talking to me, I know that they're constantly miserable, they can't sleep. And so in a microcosm, there's all these things that we discuss kind of go together, but just to show people right in front of their face, I go, don't take my or Dave's word for it when people see it in their own lives. So I've clients of mine that are gluten intolerant, and it's because they're eating what they thought was whole grains and it wasn't. Right. So I go, you're not necessarily gluten intolerant, you're eating what ain't necessarily food, right?
Yeah, and there's questions about other things that are in it. For example,
added.
Well, a lot of wheat in this country gets sprayed with glyphosate right before it's harvested, which you kind of wonder, why are we spraying herbicides on things to make it easier to process, not to kill the weeds.
Not to kill the wheat, yeah.
Putting aside the question of whether it should be doing that in the first place, but so there's real problems with gluten intolerance with people who are actually gluten intolerant. But it's I think a bit of an open question as to how much of the chronic problems that some people have had that have been attributed to gluten are actually due to gluten, as much as they are to the overprocessing of grains, and other things that come along with them.
Yep.
I've heard anecdotally from people who have had children who had real problems with eating wheat, who, when they converted to organic whole grain wheat products, those problems went away.
Exactly.
If that's the case, it's not a gluten issue.
Exactly.
And I think that's where people get things going on. So one of the real problems with a lot of these chronic diseases, which have been the real bane of the developed world in the post-World War II era, when we really sort of almost conquered many of the infectious diseases through antibiotics and cleaning up drinking water supplies. We've struggled to understand these more chronic conditions.
Right.
And it's probably due to a combination of diet, where we're eating more processed foods, so more simple sugars, less fiber, and then the effects that has had on our microbiota.
It's like you said, it's a combination. Everybody keeps trying to find it's this or it's that or it's this. It's all these things. It's all these things you're combining. I work with tons of autism. And so, like, I see parents with children with autism arguing, and I'm like, stop it. You two arguing is not helping your kids. It's just so harmful to the children. It drives me insane, right? Where they go, no, it's this. No, it's this. You're fighting over the causes? Give me a break, right? And people say it's vaccines, it's this. It's like, once again, I try to oversimplify everything. I go, it's a combination of all these things. So tell me about your pregnancy. Did you breastfeed? No. You know what I mean? It was a natural birth through the birth canal? No. C-section? Again, there's all these other components.
How many rounds of antibiotics when the kid was like between 0 and 2?
Exactly. You know what I mean? Like all these components that they never look at. I go, each one of these things contributed. It's like someone who's overweight and that you haven't seen for years. And you're like, man, what happened, buddy? He's like, I don't know. It came out of nowhere. Really? Tell me about yourself. Well, I eat Big Macs 6 times a day. I eat cake with every meal. I smoke cigarettes. I don't exercise. I don't know what it is. It's all, it's all of those things, right? We don't look at that full picture. We just want to know, is it this or is that? And real quick, I think you'll appreciate this. I have clients of mine that will go to Europe and they tell me they're gluten intolerant. So I tell the same things as you and I go, here, let's just try to adjust some things. And they go, I do notice I'm good, but if I go to a restaurant, I'll flip again, because now you're getting these things that are not necessarily what you think they are. So then they go to Europe and they go, my husband and I, we're going to Europe. We're going to eat whatever we want. And I tell them I encourage it. I give them some basic digestive enzymes and a couple basic things just to keep them well. But I go, you know what? That you saved all this money to go on vacation for 2 weeks. Go nuts. Go have fun. So she comes back and she's like, me and my husband, I've been avoiding glutens for the past 6 months. We've lost weight. We feel better, less inflammation. We feel great, right? So then she was like, "Screw it. We're taking the leash off." We ate pasta every meal, bread. You know what I mean? Cheese, everything we want. Nothing, no problems. They come back here. They went right back to regular bread. Boom, inflamed. I go, see, it's not the gluten, as you're saying. It's not this. It's not that.
You know, I've heard people tell a very similar story from their experiences.
Yeah, and these are people going nuts. This is not people experimenting. These people going like, I'm going to France. I'm eating bread every meal. I'm having bread for breakfast, right? Bread and pate for breakfast. You know, yeah. To me, that's a controlled setting. You know what I mean? Where they're like they're taking all the restrictions off. I go, that gives you a full picture.
So there's really sort of two components to that, I think, in terms of what we're starting to realize is how important our diet is to our microbiota's diet and what they then do with it. And the two components are really sort of what we choose to eat, the mix of things that we eat, and then how that food is grown and or processed.
Both ends.
And those two things they're almost independent dimensions to the problem.
Right.
Because you could have a very healthy diet of conventionally grown foods that was very rich in fruits and vegetables. And if you're, the really big difference that people have noticed between conventional organic foods nutritionally are consistently, the differences in pesticides, because of the obvious difference in practices there. But you can actually wash conventional produce and get most, if not all of it off.
Right.
And then there's all the sort of the antioxidants and the phytochemicals.
Actual nutritional content.
Yeah.
It's vastly different.
It's vastly different, but in areas that aren't often considered nutrition. They're in the other plant.
Like the skins and the fibers and the peels?
Yeah. So the phytochemicals
that we haven't necessarily classified.
The flavonoids, the polyphenols, the phenols, the things that are not classified as nutrients in the nutritional world.
And you're critical.
Yet that are very important for maintaining human health. And so there's some semantic problems in terms of how we define nutrition.
Yeah.
But...
And I try to tell people that think organic is some form of marketing or traditional farming. I explain to them that if you just have a two vegetables, right, and this one is $2 and this one's $1. Well, the organic one is $2, and people say that's twice as much. It has 6 times the nutrients. So in other case, you got ripped off. Instead of looking at this as twice as expensive, look at this as you got ripped off.
Yeah, but a parallel problem is that the organic label isn't adequate to actually draw that conclusion. What you want to know is how the practices on that farm were actually done.
Yeah.
Because there are some farms that are classified as conventional that would just get lumped in with conventional produce at a grocery store that are actually grown in ways that generate high nutrient density.
Especially in Washington here, there's a lot, quality.
And I've visited farms where the farmers are doing incredibly progressive practices for promoting soil health, growing incredible food, but they were not organic.
Yeah.
And there's other organic farms that are destroying their soil.
Now,
I don't think that's the majority of organic farms, right? But it can happen, exactly. And so if you go to the grocery store and you're just looking at the organic versus the organic label as a signal, it tells you something about how that food is grown. Right, but it's not the whole story. And that's where, with this most recent book, I got really interested in,
is that the Growing the Revolution?
Yeah, the Growing a Revolution is sort of how... what are the common elements to practices that build the fertility of the soil, which enhances the nutrient transfer to give you those nutrient-dense crops?
And getting people thinking that way and leaning that way and aspiring towards that way. Well, I always use a shortcut because I tell people exactly what we're talking about right now. And I go, it's not necessarily the organic versus the GMO. And again, I go, the best way to look at it, because nobody's going to go visit every farm they go buy stuff from. The more local you can buy it from, at least you know it's not getting shipped. Organic or not, at least it's not getting shipped from, you know what I mean? Got to be in a truck for 3 days before it gets to you by farm ripens. Yeah. So I go, if you can find local, I guarantee you those local farmers are doing practices that make them competitive because they have to, that are probably pretty good for their soil, pretty good for their...
Well, and one of the things we do know for sure about the nutritional quality of vegetables, at least, is that after you pick them, they start to drop. And so if you can eat fresher food, which, depending on how fast that truck drives,
that is another factor. That is another factor.
But, if you're eating fresher food, it is more nutritious. So I could argue that it would be better for someone in New York City to eat a locally grown produce that was conventional rather than organic produce from California.
True.
If that truck was slow.
Right.
But when you go into a grocery store, you don't know when the thing was harvested. So you don't know if that was like yesterday or last week or last month.
Yeah.
Or if the apple's been sitting in a locker for a year.
I do see younger and younger people, couples in their 20s and 30s, and and individuals doing their own growing in their little porches in their condominiums, apartments. I do see a lot more of that, which I didn't see 5-6 years ago.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? From people.
I think people are more aware of it.
They're more aware, and I think that's the big thing is the more information you provide, the more it's like, see, I don't have a bone to pick in this fight. I'm trying to help you out. I'm trying to give you the best info. Well, here's another independent thing. Like you said, these are two independent things but they work synergistically, but they function independently. Here's the third one that I think is complicated. I think most people can understand is that ever since the Industrial Revolution, we have been destroying our soil. I mean, we've been depleting mineral deposits exponentially in the U.S., right? And science usually there's usually a common ground, but there's a lot of infighting. And I think most geologists, I think pretty much every geologist in this country would agree to that, right? To the most part, like and you would know the scale that I don't. And I even have trouble conveying this to people. I read it all the time. I see U.S. News and Report, The Atlantic, they always go like, well, it turns out magnesium levels are depleting. It's like, well, that's horrifying. And then it's like, well, on to the next chapter,
right.
What does that mean though? But it seems like it's spiraling rapidly. And I think each is being buried in the news because they're like, looks like there's 60% less zinc than there was in the 70s. Well, looks like there's 80% less selenium than there was in the 80s. It keeps, you know what I mean? How many times can you hear that stat before it jostles you and be like, whoa?
Yeah, there's been a few studies that have tracked that into foods and shown that the micronutrient concentrations have gone down greatly since the 1940s. They've even gone down since the 1980s.
Yeah,
there's a lot of argument about why that is, and some of it is due to crop breeding for varieties that promote yield over nutrient density. Mm-hmm. So if you take the same amount of nutrients and divide it by twice as many kernels of corn, each one has half as much.
And genetic diversity as well.
Yeah.
There's just less, yeah.
Yep. But I would like to think that there'd be very little controversy over whether agricultural practices have resulted in degraded soil fertility in societies around the world,
right.
And it's been accelerated in the modern world under conventional agriculture.
Yep.
And that was the second book I wrote was called Dirt: The Erosion of Civilizations.
I do remember, yeah, that first one I became aware of.
Oh, great!
Yeah.
It's that was the one that really sort of got me solidly into the popular science book writing world, and it was amazing to me to research it. I sort of approached it from a geologist's interest in archaeology, and I ended up writing a history of farming.
Nice,
because it turned out that really was.
That's the reality. That's the that's the story.
That was the story.
Yep.
And one of the fun things about writing a book is that you don't know a nonfiction book is you don't really know what the story is ahead of time. I imagine that if one writes fiction, that you sort of like plot the story out and you kind of figure out what you want to do, and you probably discover things about your characters as you write them. But with nonfiction, you really kind of discover what the real story is as you do it.
Yeah.
You start off in a direction because you have an idea you want to pursue, and then you start vacuuming up information and ideas and visiting people and talking to them and discover what the story is.
You see it develop.
Yeah, and it turns out that the way that people have treated their soil, treated their land, has affected the course and fate of society after society.
Yeah.
And we're facing a similar dilemma today with where agriculture is going to go in the next 100 years.
You want to hear something crazy? So I used to live in Africa, and whenever you see Starbucks, I'm not picking on Starbucks. I'm just naming a brand, right? And because we're in Seattle, so Starbucks. When you see that like fair trade coffee from Ethiopia, right? And so you're like, great, I want to support that, which is it's a nice thing to do. It's a good way for people to give back. So living in Africa, seeing these farms where now it's gone from, like we said, a diversity of plants and vegetables and things like that, to now just singular crop, one crop. So now you're harvesting all this coffee and you're growing all this coffee and shipping it all over the world. And so the money rises at the village. People have more money, but they're like, what do I do with this money? You know what I mean? Like these people are just kind of like, I don't need a whole lot. Like we make our own clothes and, we don't need sneakers, right? And so they notice their own crops are having trouble growing their own vegetables for their own families, right? So suddenly all these resources going to grow these things. The villages technically get richer, right? But then I'm watching them and they're telling me all these stories about how they're having trouble growing these certain fruits and vegetables that their kids love and can't have that. Well, you've got more money. So what do? You go to the market and go buy these processed foods. So see how it started a cycle where the cycle didn't exist? So here we are trying to do a good thing and be like, here, welcome to the modern world. Here's a stack of cash, and people are like, yay, we made it. Like the gods must be crazy. And it's like, no, it made things so much more complicated. But the people were like, what else can we do? Like it's been 3 years of us growing these coffee beans. And each year it gets harder and harder to grow our regular food and trying to go the okra and whatever it is. So, well, let's go to the market and go buy that okra. Crazy, just on a microeconomic level, you know.
One of the places I visited in writing Growing a Revolution was Costa Rica, and I went to the heart of Costa Rican coffee country and looked at their soil, and it was amazing. It was destroyed.
Really?
Less than 100 years of
development
coffee farming, of conventional coffee farming had. The topsoil was gone. They were farming the subsoil. The rivers were orange.
Oh boy!
Because of all the erosion that was going off into them. And if you drove up into the area where the slopes of the valley sides were all coffee, and then the ridge tops had all been left in forest. Mm-hmm. So it was native forest on the ridges. You go up to the native forest in the ridges, and you dig a hole, and there's like 6 inches to a foot of this rich black earth.
Yeah.
Which had been everywhere.
Mm-hmm. It had been, yeah.
It had been everywhere. And you sort of talk to some of the farmers, and they're going, yeah, we're having a really hard time with now crop diseases that 50, 60 years ago weren't even there. They didn't know. So there's all kinds of cascading downsides to topsoil degradation and soil, what I like to call soil abuse, in terms of how we grow food. And if you take the very naturally rich, fertile topsoil out of the equation and think, well, how are we going to grow plants?
Right.
Well, the answer that we usually come to is more fertilizer and more pesticides, because you need the fertilizer to grow big plants. And then once you have plants where they're getting plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus, they get lazy and they don't put out as big a root system, which means they're not getting as many micronutrients. And
creating as rich of a nutrient. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have this trade-off between essentially growth and health of the plants, which translates into the quality of the food versus the quantity of the food.
And I think Americans don't realize it, but they've come to believe in magic. They've taken science has become so impressive and so advanced that they've turned it into magic, right? So it's kind of like
science will solve that problem.
Science will find a way to solve a problem. Yeah, exactly. Science will solve it someday. It's like with the Marie Curie when they when radium was first discovered, and they said, "Boy, you take one little tiny piece of this stuff, and you just grew an entire farm's worth of fruit, and look how huge it is." So every part of that seems like a good thing, except for the cancer. You know what I mean? Like every part of that, it's like, come on. You don't think there's a side, you know what I mean? Like drawback to that, and people don't look at the drawbacks. We look at the quick results, the instant results. So like you said, it's time for a revolution. It's time for a change in that thinking. This is just kind of just to see in a whole broad spectrum, is learning about erosion. So when I was in Africa, you hear people have these discussions about erosion, and you're like, I don't care about your opinions. Look, just see that cliff right there? Ask the villagers and tell them what happened, what they've watched the last 10 years. Your opinions are senseless. You know what I mean? Like, it's right there in front of your face. Look at it. Turn your head this way. Stop looking at me. Look over there right at that, right? And then, or all it takes is a landslide in California. You can discuss it and explain it to people till you're red in the face and, with facts and figures, until $10-50 million mansions slide into a ravine. And you're like, there you go. You know what I mean? You want to hear more discussion, or do you want to look at right there and what the effects are, right? I'm curious. Do you live here? You live here full time, or you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I teach at the University of Washington.
That's exactly. So I wasn't sure if you split time for, we are going to get nailed with an earthquake. It's happening. It's going to be in
only questions when.
It's in our lifetime. Yeah. I feel like a religious.
Depends how long we live.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's true, right? Those factors. But I'm convinced it's going to happen in our lifetime. So I try to be as pragmatic about it without freaking out and letting it control your life. What really should we be looking at? What should we be doing?
Well, so do you have your earthquake preparedness kit all set up?
Yeah, mine's pretty lazy. But you want to hear something funny? Is those MREs? Because I see all these disastrous places selling these MREs. They are nonsense, and I'm so mad at these and people. I see these mega churches selling them, and because it's like it's as rapture's coming. So buy this from me. Come on, right? One, it takes so much water to boil those things. The most number one resource during an emergency and during a disaster is water. Yeah. And you're gonna use up your entire water supply cooking these stupid meals that you paid $50 for. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. It's enough to get you for the first couple days, and then the power gets turned back on. But if there's a disaster of that magnitude, that ain't what's gonna happen. So I started I just kind of refuel boxes of like nutritional bars that are just made of nuts and berries and no additives. And then once those expire, just replace them with a new box. And it's 10 times cheaper. You're not buying it from some marketing idiot at 3 a.m. It blows my mind. And you want to hear something funny? Because like we've been talking about is that it's not whole food. It has to be stabilized to a point where it'll last for a decade, right?
Yeah.
So I bought 3 packs from 15 years ago. Okay, I'm sorry. I bought 3 cases, so a pack of 12, and lunch and dinner for I just started eating them just to do a little research myself because people ask me these questions, and so I'm like, you know what? I don't give people an answer unless I know for a fact, right? I'm not going to kind of mesh things together. Within 3 days, Dave, headaches, nausea. I was miserable. I was sick, depressed. 3 days. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, man.
Because it's not, when people see enriched with iron, people buy that and go, ooh, this Twinkies enriched with iron.
Yeah.
That's not food full
Enriched
of
with
iron.
and no fiber.
And no fiber, enriched with chemicals, with chemicals, with thiamine and bio. It's not real vitamin B1. It's a chemical version. And within 3 days, made me so sick and tired and exhausted. Headaches, because I'd been just consuming chemicals for 3 days straight. Wow. Isn't that bizarre? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, we had an earthquake preparedness kit for a while. That was after King of Fish came out, I was asked to go up and give a talk at the Sitka Seafood Festival up in Alaska.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways they paid me is they gave me a box of frozen salmon.
That ain't bad.
Like 75 pounds of frozen salmon.
I'll take
or something.
that. Yeah.
No, that was terrific.
Yeah.
So what we did is we threw that in the freezer in the basement.
Yep.
And then we bought an extra thing of propane for the barbecue. And that was our earthquake preparedness plan until we ended up eating all the fish. But
right, that happens. Yeah.
The goal was, okay, when the power goes out, it'll start thawing out. We start barbecuing and invite the neighbors over.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. You know what I mean? That's as simple as you can make it. As simple as you make it.
Yeah, but the water is
flashlight and bullets. It's water, flashlight, and bullets. That's all. That's all. The water is the number one problem, right?
Yeah, well, that's where the water heater in your house that will become your water supply if you have the presence of mind to actually secure it and then drain it when you need it.
Yeah. And how many people really get their own fresh water supplies? Nobody. It's all.
No, I mean it's basically the pipes to your house are going to break.
Yep.
It's whatever's there. So
yep.
You want and. In this region, we could be on our own for a week or two in a big earthquake.
That's kind of what I picture.
It's well worth worrying about.
Mm-hmm. What's going to happen geologically?
Well, basically, the Pacific Ocean is going to be shoved under North America by 15 to 30 feet.
Yikes!
Yeah, and it will be a mess.
Yeah,
the disaster scenario for the next really big mega quake in Seattle are really ugly.
Yeah, everything that I've seen, everything I've read, every little bit is just like, yeesh. The digger I deep, the worse it gets. I keep waiting for that good news to be like, but there is this. Nope. Each time you dig deeper, it's a new mess.
Yeah.
Where's the fall? Where's the falling? It's like I-90, isn't it?
Well, if you're looking at the mega quake, the whole subduction margin quake, the one that could be magnitude 9 plus, the fault is actually at Seattle. It's like 20, 30 miles down. It's right. It's this whole. Imagine that there's this. Imagine the seafloor underneath the Pacific, and the bedrock for that extends down and dips under Western North America. And imagine that being shoved. It's kind of like a wedge.
Yeah.
Imagine that being shoved under the mountains that are here, and what the kind of energy that it would take to do that.
Oh man!
And then the shaking that would engender.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be like a 3 to 5 minute, mega shake.
Yeah.
The last big one we had here in 2001, the Nisqually earthquake. That didn't even last a minute, I don't think.
Yeah.
And we're talking about something 3 to 5 times longer. I lost 2 chimneys off my house in that one.
Yeah.
And as did a lot of other people.
Yep. 3 to 5 times. Yeah. It's incredible. And that one was pretty deep beneath the surface. This one's probably going to be closer to the surface. Right?
Well, no, the big one here would be deep.
It would be pretty deep.
But there's so that's one scenario. If you want to talk disaster scenarios for Seattle, the other is a shallow quake on the Seattle Fault, which runs right between the two stadiums down just south of downtown, and runs right out to Issaquah. Probably runs right through here somewhere.
Oh goodness!
Lucky you.
Lucky us.
And that one's a shallow fault.
Okay.
So if you had a smaller earthquake, but it was closer to the surface, it'll be pretty destructive at the surface, but over a smaller area.
Okay.
That subduction zone quake is going to be deep and big. And you'll have shaking from Northern California to Canada. But the Seattle Fault is going to be shaking from like Tacoma to Everett.
Yikes! Yeah. I'm always fascinated by those things. It's just some people get crippled by it and they just succumb to it. I'm like, no, I just like to know. I just want to know the facts. I want to go to a plane. I'm the guy that likes to know where the exits are. It's never going to happen. Planes don't bother me. I like plane flying. But in case it happens, I'm like, I'm just going to have to crawl over that lady's lap and that dude's luggage and I'm out. You know what I mean? Like the rest of you should have listened to the thing. Should listen to the presentation. Figure it out. Well, as you know, like we've covered a lot. And again, with all your books, there's so much more. Each one specifically goes into another realm, which opens up a whole new chapter of what we can learn. If you could deliver one, because as you know, the podcast called Everything You Know Is Wrong, right? With these crazy misconceptions that just get in the way of just the most basic forms of information, right? If there was a couple things that you could take out of the conversation and reopen things, what would those be?
Boy, well, I'm gonna pick a couple. I could go through each book and pick one or two, but the ones that I've been thinking about now is I actually put out a piece on a platform called The Conversation a couple days ago, or a couple weeks ago at this point, that looked at some of the big myths of modern agriculture in terms of whether the first thing you sort of hear when you talk about how are we going to feed the world 100 years from now is people go, oh, well, we need GM crops. We need large-scale conventional agriculture. Neither is actually true when you actually get into it and look at the data. There's caveats to that, but there are other ways to get there that are worth thinking about in terms of our policies and what we subsidize agriculturally or not. And in terms of thinking about our own bodies and the microbes within us, I mean, we've tried to sanitize microbes out of our lives for decades.
Right.
And that was incredibly misguided. Turns out that little kids really need to be exposed to microbial life in the first couple of years of life to build their immune system.
I cough on every child I see.
Oh, well, that's not what I'm talking about. But let them go play in the dirt.
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
Like George Carlin used to say, he's like, my generation swam in sewage and filth and never get sick. You know why? Because we swam in sewage and filth.
And it's so there's these basic conceptions of how we see the world that have been changing that affect sort of the mythologies that we carry with us day to day in terms of what we think modern farming is. And I've done a couple interviews on the new book where people talk about modern versus organic farming. It's like, no, actually what I think to be like really cutting edge farming is how can you actually grow as much food as possible with as few chemicals as possible, which might be getting it down to none in some cases. And using ecology as the science to drive it rather than chemistry and physics. Yep. Now, chemistry and physics matter to farming a lot.
Right.
But it's the microbial ecology is what we've neglected. And so I see the opportunities to really, for transformative change.
For something that's been way overlooked. Might be the key component. Interesting.
Yeah. And actually, that's kind of a good thing to end on in terms of how this all relates to science, because it's often those areas that have been overlooked where there's room for transformative progress.
True.
And in the last couple decades, that's often been the space between disciplines, where you've had people really digging deep on the science, but very narrowly. And now scientists are starting to look to the sides and go, oh, well, how does geology relate to biology?
Yeah.
And that gets you into rethinking soil fertility, which may transform agriculture.
Yep.
So those spaces between can be really valuable.
As you said, the numbers lay out, like Mark Twain, there's three types of information in this world: lies, damn lies, and statistics. There's a gentleman, he's actually from Washington State, right? And for years, the White House has been using agrochemicals and things like that because the White House has to look spectacular in every picture, every photo op, right? And so, of course, this guy, he's a botanist and a well known. Everyone calls him like the genius landscaper, right? So just multi-million-dollar properties and this and that, and any sort of museum that opens, he's the one that's doing the landscaping and optimizing, like you said, the ecology. He takes a look at the ecology of that area, says, well, these types of plants will grow better in this soil, and these will feed this, and he feng shuis all the plants and puts them together, right? And so somebody had just recommended him for the White House, and I don't remember if it was under the Clintons or maybe, right? And so for years, all these chemical companies had been doing the White House for decades. We're just like, absolutely not. Here's our list of reasons why. Here's the number of blah blah blah. Right?
Dude's crazy. Can't work.
The guy's a hippie weirdo. Can't. Yeah, he's gonna, you know what I mean, ruin the White House and ruin America for everybody, right? Yeah. And the guy simply presented his plan. You know what I mean? He's like, it costs 1/600th of the budget. You know what I mean? That's not what they wanted to hear. Right. The agro companies did not want to hear that, right? And so, of course, the people in charge were like, okay, I think we're done talking here, right? It's like, so you can say, you can do the same job for 1/600th of the government of taxpayer dollars, right? Of the Johnny Paycheck, like you and me kicking into, and he's like, not only that, he's like, I'll make it far better. And ever since, he's been the White House's guy. Wow. You know what I mean? Every it's the same thing. Every new administration is just kind of like, that's one thing we don't change, because he's now feng shuied it to where like it's a self-sustaining.
Because it works.
It works, and now the White House is like a self-sustaining environment on its own. Isn't that crazy? Like
that's neat.
That fundamental change tips the scales, and now there's no going back. Just like how GE and DuPont spent years poisoning rivers and just creating the most harsh chemicals ever, until some bean counter said, if we went a little more organic and green, it actually help us out. And that all they cared about is the dollars and cents. The second they said what, suddenly DuPont and GE developed these green energy departments. You know what I mean? So like, oh no, we've always believed in blah, blah, blah. Come on. Now you see where the money is. And I think, cynically, I think now that people see, by taking care of the soil and changing some of these ways that we've been doing for years, actually is better financially. You know what I mean? And so I think that might be the motivating factor for them to actually study microbes and look at these things and maybe incorporate them. So...
yeah, and that could also be the factor that helps some of these ideas for transformative change actually stick.
Exactly.
Because many of the farmers I talked to researching growing our evolution, they had various reasons for why they adopted the practices that they did, but they liked the fact that it rebuilt the fertility of their soil. They liked the fact that it maintained their crop yields, but they loved the fact that it saved them money. Yes,
exactly. And that's the key. I think if more companies realize that, even if it's not for the right reasons, just for that reason alone, they may be like, let's reevaluate our books. Well, this has been fun. You enjoy yourself?
Yeah. It was fun to talk to you.
Thanks for coming out.
Oh, no worries. My pleasure. I don't get to hang out in a treehouse every day.
Not every day, right? Yep. We do, but that's different. And we'll put some more information on the website. So anybody that wants to learn more and get your books and learn more and complete the discussion, and maybe throw you some questions the next time we have it,
That sounds great. And we've got a website, dig2grow.com. Or if people are interested in Twitter, we're active on Twitter, and our handle's @dig2grow.
It's good branding. It's good branding. Yeah. Kids do like the Twitter. Yep. Well, thanks, Dave. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, no worries. Pleasure's mine.
Talk soon. Wasn't that dope? He is, he's great to talk to. We talked about some fun stuff off air too, so I'd love to have him back another time, and we'll talk about some other ideas. But it's all changing. It's all growing. He's gaining prominence nationally, which couldn't be more happy for him and thrilled for him, and the recognition that his work is getting. He recently spoke at a panel with Howard Buffett, who is Warren Buffett's son, and boy, he enjoyed what Howard had to say, and Howard is a real big fan of his. So it's well worth taking the time to invest. So absolutely check out his books, learn more about him. If you want to check him out on Twitter, or his website is very simple, easy. Dig2grow. Dig, DIG, the number 2, GROW, and the Twitter feed is the same. Dig, the number 2, GROW. And absolutely trace his work and track him. And we're so glad we got to have him, and we really hope you enjoyed. We will talk to you soon. Peace.
Everything you know is wrong should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is barely even a person. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read on our website should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use common sense before doing anything you might think have a lasting effect on your body, mind, or spirit.